Evangelicals represent one of the strongest lobbying forces in the United States. And as we will hear today, their influence extends far beyond our borders. To cite just one example, think back to the Cold War. The advocacy of persecuted Christians behind the Iron Curtain swayed our foreign policy towards the Soviet Union. Now, at this time, when some are worrying about how the U.S. might be withdrawing internationally, faith groups continue to advocate for strong global engagement. Hi, everyone. I'm Jim Falk, President of the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth, and I hope you had a very nice Labor Day weekend. To bring context to this subject, we are joined by diplomatic historian Lauren Frances Turek. She's the author of a new book, To Bring the Good News to All Nations, Evangelical Influence on Human Rights and U.S. Foreign Relations. I saw the review for this book on July 14th in the Wall Street Journal, and one of the great things about my position at the World Affairs Council, when I see something like that, I have the opportunity, thanks to you, to reach out to the author, and I'm so pleased that Lauren was able to join us. And I'm especially happy that she's going to be in conversation with one of my neighbors, Kate Carté. Kate is a professor of history at the Hilltop, or as we say, Southern Methodist University. I want to remind all of you, if you are new to watching our program, you get a 10% discount on your purchase of To Bring the Good News to All Nations by going to interabangbooks.com. That's interabangbooks.com. Type in the code dfwworld just for your online purchase, and you'll get 10% off on To Bring the Good News to All Nations, as well as any books that might be in your shopping cart. I hope all of you follow us on YouTube. You can subscribe on our YouTube channel, just search DFW World, or you can go to our website, dfwworld.org. You saw in the open that we have a lot of great programs coming up, many more coming that we'll be announcing the next few days. As I mentioned, Kate Carté is an associate professor of history at Southern Methodist University. She's also the author of a book, her first book was Religion and Profit, Moravians in the Early America. She's got a new book that's coming out in a few months, and I hope she'll take a chance to tell you a little bit about that. Lauren, you might ask Kate about her book. That book is titled Religion, Revolution, and Imperial History. Kate received her Ph.D. and Master's from the University of Wisconsin in Madison and her BA from Haverford College. So with that, Kate, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I get to sit back and enjoy the program. Thanks again.
Thank you, Jim, for that lovely introduction. And I am particularly excited to get the chance here to talk to Lauren Frances Turek about her work, and also to get the chance to introduce her here. Dr. Turek is a diplomatic historian whose research focuses on the history of U.S. foreign relations, religion, and the human rights movement in the United States. To Bring the Good News to All Nations, Evangelical Influence on Human Relations and U.S. Evangelical Influence on Human Rights and U.S. Foreign Relations is her first book publication. She did her PhD at the University of Virginia, which got a big shout out from Jim a few minutes ago. And she also has an MA from NYU in museum studies. Lauren, I'm particularly interested to hear about that. And right now she is she's an assistant professor at Trinity University in San Antonio, and director of the museum studies program there. And also, most importantly, I think an oboist, which I've learned is the musical instrument I need to champion. So, so it's a particular privilege to get a chance to talk to you today, Lauren.
Thank you so much, and I really appreciate being invited to speak with everybody.
Well, so to get us started on this incredible book, I'm going to hold it up here. I don't know if we've seen the cover, but I don't know if we've seen the book yet. To get us started, I'd love if you could just let us know what led you to this project and how you formulated, and kind of what the central questions you asked in the book were.
Absolutely. So I was doing research on the history of U.S. domestic interest groups that were very resistant to Nixon's foreign policy with the Soviet Union, resistance to détente. And I was very surprised to see included among the various groups, such as Jewish interest groups and scientists, a number of evangelical Christians who were speaking out against détente from the perspective of a concern about human rights abuses in the Soviet Union. And I said to myself, when I think about evangelicals, I usually think about domestic social issues such as abortion or prayer in school. And if I think about foreign policy, I assume it has something to do with Israel. But here we have a group of evangelical Christians who are really engaged in different types of foreign policy questions. And I wanted to investigate that further. So I began to do research on the role that evangelicals played in exploring and advocating on human rights issues throughout the 70s, 80s, and into the 90s, because the sort of capstone to the project, of course, the capstone to my story, is the passage of the International Religious Freedom Act in 1998, where evangelicals played a crucial role in getting that legislation passed, which was something that was surprising to many pundits at the time. They seemed as though they had come out of nowhere. And so my story tells the sort of longer history of that and suggests that no, there had been evangelical activism on these human rights issues for quite some time. So I did research in 17 different archives in the United States, Guatemala, and South Africa to develop the story of how it was that evangelicals came to be foreign policy activists, how their activism actually affected U.S. foreign policies. So I was very curious to understand, well, how do interest groups influence foreign policymakers? What type of action do they take that can be influential? How does that activism play out on the ground? And how did that fit in with evangelical missionary work? Because the other piece of the story is a revival in evangelical missionary work beginning in the late 60s and early 70s. How did these pieces all fit together?
Well, that's a fantastic place to start. One of the arguments, as you mentioned these different interest groups, one of the arguments that really drew my attention was your focus on communications technology and the way that functioned to bring these together. Can you tell us a little bit about those communication networks?
Absolutely. So evangelicals were early adopters of all sorts of technology. And one of the key stories that I trace in the book, again, is evangelicals at the start, the sort of end of the 1960s, start of the 1970s, they were looking out on a world that was rapidly changing. And they were looking out on a world that was not just rapidly changing in terms of technology or globalization, but also a world that was rapidly changing in terms of demographics. And so what they were seeing was huge swaths of Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, Asia, that had relatively few Christians, but growing population. And so they were very eager to find a way, because of their core mission to evangelize, to share the gospel with the entire world. They were very eager to find ways to connect with people in those foreign countries. And they needed to find ways to communicate potentially across cultural divides, but also in countries that were hostile to Christians, right, to Christian missionary work. So you might think of the communist countries that were closed to evangelism, but also some Muslim countries and others that evangelicals viewed as sort of hostile to their goals. And so they used technology such as clandestine radio networks, as well as satellite broadcasts of radio, satellite broadcasts of TV, to create programming in a range of different languages and cultural experiences so that they could share their message across cultural divides and across political divides. They were very early advocates of drawing on satellite technology, and I have an entire chapter that talks about how those networks developed. But part of that was really rooted in a desire to connect with evangelicals that were local to those regions, to train them to create this programming, and to then communicate with evangelicals in the United States as well as in other countries. So we would see lots of letters coming in from listeners in the Soviet bloc. So in that way, it was really two-way communication. They are listening to these radio broadcasts, but they're also receiving letters or sending letters to evangelical producers. And it creates this mechanism of communication that allowed for evangelicals in the US to learn about what was happening overseas, and for people in parts of the world that maybe were close to evangelism to hear the gospel message or hear news about what was happening in the Western world.
So how, as they're reaching out to these places, some of the places that you're mentioning, places in the Muslim world, places in Africa where South Africa where you've got a lot of focus, there's always the potential that U.S. Christians, exporting their message, that they'll be viewed as kind of American imperialism, right? This is the era of decolonization in the 60s and the 70s. So how did evangelicals ensure that they weren't butting up against those kinds of sensibilities?
This was such a challenge for them. In 1974, Billy Graham organized a huge conference on world evangelization, and it was very notable because it included a number of presenters who were from the global south, who were from Africa, Asia, Latin America. And this was the very issue that many of these speakers who came to this conference talked about. They said, these American or Western missionaries come in, they are bringing their culture, they've wrapped the gospel in their culture, it's cultural imperialism. And those preachers, including folks like C. Rene Padilla, who was an Ecuadorian theologian, they're very critical of that, and they want to see local evangelism. They want to see folks who are indigenous providing that evangelism, and they want actually call for a moratorium on missions from the West. Well, Billy Graham and many of the U.S. evangelicals are quite concerned about that, and they are also, reading actively. They know that there are critiques of cultural imperialism, and so what we see coming out of the conference and in the various publications that they develop in the years that followed it are these efforts to try to square that circle, that, well, they don't want to stop doing missionary work. They want to make sure that they can get into countries where there aren't very many evangelicals, but they are also acknowledging this problem that they should not be bringing in a gospel that is wrapped in Americanism. And yet that is very hard for them to accomplish because they elevate the need to evangelize and the need to share their message above everything else. That's the kind of crucial goal for them. Whereas evangelicals from places in Latin America are saying, in order for us to be able to reach people, we need to deal with the social problems of the world. We need to break poverty. We need to break, C. Rene Padilla said that slavery and the man's slavery in the world. These are not the concerns that U.S. evangelicals wanted to focus on. They were not as interested in that social justice orientation. And so there's this real conflict that emerges. But that conflict at the same time also deeply informs the human rights orientation that many evangelicals develop over the 70s and 80s, because they're prioritizing the focus on evangelism when they're encountering human rights abuses. They become concerned about those when they impact their ability to evangelize. Mm-hmm. So they're wrestling with the problem of cultural imperialism. They talk about it in their meetings, but I'm not sure that they're fully able to resolve it for themselves or for their potential counterparts in the other parts of the world.
Well, and of course, there's an irony embedded there in your story that then they become so effective at mobilizing U.S. policy, right? And it's very difficult to separate U.S. policy from U.S. The stretch of U.S. power abroad. So even as they're sort of skeptical of it, they're also then going to harness it because it's such a powerful tool, right? It occurs to me that the question of and this is a question that came in on the Q&A. You're using the term evangelical, and we use it all the time, but embedded in that term are a whole series of questions. One of them is just sort of what is an evangelical, but also I wonder if you could address the question of the sort of Baptist and Pentecostal groups that are gaining power within this, as opposed to the denominational traditional denominational groups. You do a great job of fleshing that out in the book.
Yes, this is always such a fascinating question because, of course, religious historians and religious studies scholars are arguing all the time about how do we define an evangelical. And of course, I'm a diplomatic historian. I didn't want to get too bogged down in the theoretical debate, but I wanted to think very hard about which individuals and groups should be in this book. So I looked at a lot of definitions from religious studies scholars, and I ultimately decided that there was a sociologist, a man named Mark Shibley, who had a really helpful definition. And I used that to help myself think through this. But he defines an evangelical as this kind of broad group of believers who've had a born-again experience, right? That they've developed a personal relationship with Jesus Christ through this born-again experience, that they accept the full authority of the Bible in their life, right? Their conduct of everyday affairs and in matters of faith. And crucially for me, that they are committed to spreading the gospel through public witness. So that definition does a number of things that I find very helpful and that really helped me in setting up the book. It's capacious, but also simple. It addresses practice and belief. And it accounts for the incredible diversity of evangelical practice and belief. And it takes individuals at their word. This is a very individualistic set of faith views, set of faith practices, and one that really emphasizes the kind of practice of going out into the world, which was so key for my book. We know that there are lots of different expressions of evangelicalism. They vary by race, by region, by culture. So I wanted a very broad definition, but one that emphasized practice as well as belief. So from there, I could focus down, though. I was able to look at the various denominations that fall under the heading of evangelical, and also non-denominations. There are a number of evangelical non-denominational churches. That definition was broad enough to allow me to look at individuals, parachurch organizations, and most crucially to focus on those groups that had the largest influence on policymaking. So I was able to focus in particular on groups that were members of the National Association of Evangelicals, which became more influential as a lobbying body, especially in the late 1970s. But it didn't shut out other expressions of evangelicalism like Pentecostalism or charismatic Christianity, which were just exploding in population and popularity, not just in the United States in the 1970s, but really throughout the world, and especially in parts of Africa and Asia. So looking at evangelicalism in that way allowed me to talk about really influential groups in the United States, but also influential groups abroad, and to think about how they worked together to this common goal of evangelizing the world.
Thank you. That's such a succinct definition you're working with there. I can see where it does a lot of work for you, and in a way, what it really draws to mind is how different it is. You know, as I'm sure we're both really familiar. The definition of evangelical that floats around in political circles now has, people like Thomas Kidd have been arguing it doesn't even have anything to do with faith anymore, because it's become a political identifier. And in particular, one of the things that's come to light in the last few years is the phrase white evangelicals and the Trump evangelicals, right? The 81% who voted for 81% of white evangelicals who voted for Donald Trump. And what I find interesting about your story is that the actors that you have engaging, in Guatemala, in South Africa, all around the world, the sort of racial construct that they're working with seems really different from what we hear in the news now. And I'm wondering if you could just sort of reflect a little bit on how race was working for them. I mean, they're post-civil rights movement, right? They're right after that. How is race figuring into this world?
It's a very sort of complex situation because, of course, most of the foreign policy activists that I'm writing about in the United States were white evangelicals. And so when they get involved in issues, for example, such as their opposition to the movement to impose sanctions or to disinvest from South Africa, there is a considerable pushback from not just Black evangelical groups, but also some more politically progressive evangelicals. So part of the Southern Baptists were kind of driven out of positions of authority over this question because they wanted to disinvest, and the Southern Baptist Convention took a completely different tack. So we're actually seeing, I think, some of the origins of some of this separation that we see now, that there's, we tend to think now of evangelicals as being consistently aligned with conservative political policies in the United States, that it is in some ways a kind of conservative cultural phenomenon. That was not always the case. If we look earlier in the 60s and 70s, evangelicals did not necessarily vote in a block the way that they do now, right? White evangelicals. That happened over time. That's a process that I trace in the book, particularly as the cultural issues for the religious right became really significant by the late 70s. But that's a process that happened. So there is, and we sometimes forget the importance of the evangelical left that existed. We sometimes leave out Black evangelicals, Latinx evangelicals, who represent a significant portion of evangelicalism, both in the United States and abroad. And what we're seeing then is this conflict that emerges, because the perspective that white evangelicals develop on U.S. foreign policy, again, is not the same one that, say, Black evangelicals develop. It's not the same one that evangelicals throughout the world do. So I think we're seeing in this story some of where we are now kind of starting to bubble up. through their lobbying, particularly as they become more powerful.
You know, another way that I saw sort of resonances of something that takes a different shape later that I found so powerful was your discussion of freedom of conscience. And again, you know, Jim was, you know, I work on the American Revolution. He referenced that. So freedom of conscience in the era that I work on in the 18th century is very much sort of an intellectual thing. It's freedom of thought, right? And it's often sort of, it's kind of synonymous with religious freedom, but not yet, not really, because conscience is something that's really private. It's intensely private, right? And the version of religious freedom that you discuss is the right to both practice and propagate, right? Which is such a radically different version of freedom of conscience. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about sort of where that comes from and how it develops.
Yeah, so much of this does come out of that concern that evangelicals evince over initially persecution against Christians in the Soviet Union. So this had long been a concern for evangelicals in the United States, but as they became more politically effective as a lobby, more politically powerful in the 70s, they noticed that it seems as though persecution is ramping up in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union in that era. They're very concerned that the United States is not doing enough to counter that. They want to see stronger action. And they begin to testify in Congress on these issues. They bring in escaped dissidents. They bring in the testimony of people who have suffered in the Soviet Union from physical torture, beatings, for psychiatric treatment, children being denied access to religious education, churches being burned down. So they bring all of that into congressional testimony about human rights in the Soviet Union in the sort of 70s. And what happens over time is that these evangelical interest groups that are lobbying on these issues, they start to develop their own definition of human rights that is focused primarily on freedom of religion or freedom of conscience. And that view for them is rooted in their commitment to achieving the Great Commission. They believe that it's their spiritual duty to spread the Christian gospel. And they want a foreign policy that's going to protect their freedom to evangelize and the freedom of the unreached to hear the gospel. For them, there's no earthly privation that could possibly compare to the loss of the potential for eternal salvation. What could be worse? And so they advocate for religious liberty on the idea that that is the first freedom, and from there other freedoms could come. This is a different take on human rights than, say, the secular groups or more progressive human rights groups like Amnesty International that focused on freedom from bodily harm, social rights, that sort of thing. But this thinking about human rights in this way allows them to define a vision for human rights that's a conservative vision in the 1970s that's competing with liberal perspectives or views on human rights. And so for them, it's an active view of that first freedom, that active view of religious liberty, where it's not just something that they need to kind of protect at home. It needs to be part of foreign policy, and they want to change policies in other countries, which of course is going to throw up conflict with countries in the Soviet Union that say this is a breach of our sovereignty. And yet US leaders, because of pressure from evangelicals, bring these issues up consistently in summits and meetings with their Soviet counterparts. It becomes a regular conversation for them to the point where it does, in sort of concert with dissident movements in those countries, it does put a tremendous amount of pressure on the Soviet Union for change.
Well, and as you know, you described how in the Soviet Union there was a process by which a church could be registered, right? Yes, so yes. If you were a Baptist living in the Soviet Union, you could be a part of an open church, and you could go to that church and you could worship. But there were restrictions on what you could do, and you couldn't proselytize, right? So how do the evangelical groups work around the fact that it's perfectly legal to be a Baptist in Russia? You just can't tell anybody else to be whatever. Not just, I don't want to highlight the Baptist too much there, but you can't spread it.
Right, and it's the same for a lot of the Pentecostals in the Soviet Union. But it's not just that they can't spread it, right? They also can't teach their children, which is a form of evangelism. But I think that really was upsetting to many of those to evangelicals who were in the Soviet Union, but also seemed quite upsetting to evangelicals in the United States. And so what would happen in the Soviet Union for those churches that wanted to, they said, this is, again, a core part of our practice, a core part of our belief is evangelism. If we can't evangelize because we're in a registered church, then we're not fully living our faith. So it's a real infringement on our ability to live our faith. And so what would happen is they would have underground church meetings, sometimes outside, clandestine meetings. They also, just to go back to technology, they would record gospel teachings in Russian that were coming from religious radio stations, from evangelical broadcasts. They would record those on tapes and share the tapes around. They would actually hand notate if they would take down one of the more popular programs that evangelicals would put on their radio stations would be dictation speed readings of certain gospels. And so what we would see in the Soviet Union would be people with these sort of handwritten Bibles, because they didn't have full access to a Bible, so they would hand write from the radio program in translation at dictation speed that they could then share around, which is sort of a fascinating. And of course, that would capture the imagination of evangelicals in the United States. When they would go to testify in Congress about this, they would share those stories, and they were very stirring, very emotional for people in Congress who many by the 1970s were evangelical, but even if they weren't, many were Christian and found that very compelling.
Well, so as they go, you mentioned them testifying in Congress. What are the structures that get them to a place where they can testify in Congress, right? How do they connect sort of that passion for global missions to congressional action?
Yeah, initially it's leaders of organizations. So they're, members of Congress who were looking into these issues, and this could be issues in, U.S. relations on human rights in the Soviet Union, but later it was human rights issues in other countries as well, Guatemala, South Africa, so on and so forth. We would see, you'd see evangelical leaders of groups like the National Association of Evangelicals or the Institute on Religion and Democracy, or some of these smaller groups that were founded by dissidents who had come to the United States as refugees and had sort of set up shop in places. So they would learn about them either through letters from constituents, or they would receive newsletters. There was an entire organization in Congress founded in 1980 called the Christian Rescue Effort for the Emancipation of Dissidents that tried to get a handle on all of these groups. There were many of them. But basically they would then be invited to share their testimony, and they would sometimes, again, bring in testimony from folks who had been affected by religious persecution abroad. But that was the mechanism by which it happened. It often starts in hearings. And then the other way in which this gets into congressional debate is some senators or representatives would introduce writings from evangelical groups, from newsletters, from constituent letters into the record, so that it would be part of the discussion at hand.
So what policies specifically did they want to change through congressional efforts?
One thing in terms of U.S. relations with the Soviet Union, they're very eager, and countries in the Eastern Bloc, they're very eager to hinge U.S. trade relations on the compliance of those countries with international human rights norms, and they would often say, and with the actual norms that are written to their constitution. So for example, in 1974, there's a trade act that was passed, in part because of lobbying by Jewish groups. Part of that trade act was premised on a certification that the country that the U.S. was trading with was not persecuting people based on their religious beliefs or preventing them from emigrating. This was a really effective cudgel for foreign policy activists until it was removed, until that part of the act was removed much later and much more recently. So what evangelicals would do is they would say we should not be extending most favored nation or normalized trading status to this country or that country because they persecute Christians. And that puts a real potential constraint on whichever presidential administration is in place at that time. And so there was the Reagan administration found this very frustrating, especially when they were attempting to differentiate their policy between how they were treating the Soviet Union and how they were treating potentially more independent states in Eastern Europe. Evangelicals were not, this was one of those moments where we see a disalignment between the evangelical lobby and the Reagan administration, where they're saying, nope, Romania is terribly repressive for Christians. We shouldn't be extending normalized trade relations. But there's the sort of flip side to that too, is that when they find regimes that they want to support, even if they're very authoritarian or repressive, such as the regime of Rios Montt in Guatemala. He was an evangelical dictator who came to power. He was also committing devastating human rights abuses, and there was a trial for genocide much later. So this is a guy who is absolutely committing barbaric acts against the indigenous people in his country. Evangelicals see him and say, he is an evangelical, he's saying he's going to turn Guatemala to God, we should be sending him aid. And they would lobby for the provision of military materiel and other sorts of aid. And when they didn't get as much as they wanted, they did their own fundraising to try to send it themselves and to reach out to countries elsewhere to get that aid to them. So it happens in a number of different ways, and they're able to influence policy. They're also influencing the way that policymakers are thinking about issues of human rights. So by introducing a conservative conception for human rights, they actually shape how Congress members talk about it. It provides a language for, in particular for conservative congressmen and for conservative administrations, to use human rights language, to use a human rights ethos to frame their policies, so that, because of course the idea of human rights is very powerful. You don't want to be against human rights. If there is a conservative expression or vision for human rights, that's a useful tool for conservative administrations.
How does the Fellowship Foundation work into this? That's a group that's got some interesting press lately. There was a Netflix, I think it was Netflix, kind of pseudo documentary on it. You know, so how do you see their role in this?
I found the Fellowship Foundation fascinating in terms of this, because so they're ostensibly a non-denominational, ostensibly nonpartisan group, and what they were trying to do is set up these what they call cell groups, essentially, all throughout the world, that are going to be Christians who can become involved in the government, and they have fellowship with each other, right? They're going to share this Christian worldview, and these connections between Christians and other countries will create what they hope to see as a better leadership. What I found very interesting is that those groups were writing, groups that were established, again, local groups on the ground in these other countries, they're writing back to the Fellowship Foundation, and they're, despite what the official word is, they are, of course, deeply involved in the politics of those countries. In South Africa, there is a Fellowship Foundation cell group that is established, and the explicit goal is to get folks who are high up in the government in South Africa, in Pretoria, to be in conversation with the Fellowship Foundation in the United States, with the idea being that they're going to find ways to influence policy quietly. What happens, one of the letters that I found that was really fascinating, is that there is actual communication from some of the leaders of these cell groups writing from South Africa saying, oh, well, we're here, you know, I think we can try to find ways to influence apartheid policies and that sort of thing. And they write to the leaders of the Fellowship Foundation in the United States, who write back and say, do not put this in letters. This is a phone call only kind of conversation. We don't want somebody to see what we're talking about here. They could misinterpret it. I don't think I misinterpreted it. It just shows that they are, in fact, quite interested in ways that they can informally influence policy in other countries, and again, develop a network of evangelicals throughout the world who can be influential on these matters. So the Fellowship Foundation plays an interesting, if quiet, role, but it's part of that larger evangelical network. And I think it goes to the idea that part of what's interesting about evangelicalism is, say, unlike the Catholic Church, which is very hierarchical, you know, top down, evangelicalism, it's very dispersed. And so what's fascinating is, despite the fact that there's no single hierarchy, everybody can kind of do their own thing, we're still seeing this network develop that has many nodes and cross connections that becomes very powerful at this time.
Is that what you think makes it so successful? Is it the network status of it? You know, you kind of identified a variety of factors here in terms of, you know, communication strategies and connections to Congress, and is it the anti-communist moment? So what's the sort of alchemy here that makes this work?
I think that there are so many people pursuing these broad goals. So the goals are united. The goal is evangelism. It's a very simple goal that they have, but it's a challenging one to actually implement. And so because they have all of this dispersed activity, everyone can experiment and try different things. There's actually a lot of anxiety that they're going to duplicate efforts and maybe it'll be too much, but I actually think that's kind of the genius of it for them, or what works so well for them, is that there is so much activity happening and people are so strongly committed to it. It's high stakes for them. They feel very personally invested, and so there's just a tremendous amount of effort, and just so many organizations that come up. And it gives, I think, the impression of a unity and a sort of power and a reach that is influential to members of Congress. They're also organizing trips in a lot of cases to some of these countries to see what's happening. They, evangelical groups organize trips with congressmen to Romania. They organize trips to Guatemala. So that's also, I think, pretty significant that they're able to tap that network to take Congress people to these places to bring people in.
And give them a very particular view of what's
absolutely
going on
like very much frame their trip.
Well, and at the same time, these groups don't always agree with each other, right? I was really struck by the Siberia 7 and the fact they weren't so pleased to have Billy Graham show up there. So can you kind of introduce the Siberian 7 to us and tell us a little bit about that, what leads up to that moment?
Sure. The Siberian 7 were a group of Pentecostals who were in the Soviet Union. They had faced a tremendous amount of persecution. Some had been arrested. And they flee at one point to the they flee to the U.S. Embassy at one point, and they essentially take refuge there, and they live in the basement of the embassy, seeking emigration. They want to be allowed to leave the Soviet Union, and they're worried though, because they when Billy Graham comes, they're worried that he's going to be used for propaganda purposes, that his visit is going to be highlighted by the Soviet leadership, and they're going to say, see, things really aren't that bad. We've got Billy Graham here. It's all fine. What's interesting is, of course, the Siberian 7, I highlight a couple different dissident groups that are dissidents in the Soviet Union who face persecution, and where the Siberian 7 really do want to emigrate and leave. What's interesting is that many evangelicals in the Soviet Union did not, and I tell the story of Georgy Vins, who was also a dissident, who was imprisoned, who gets released and sent to the United States as part of a prisoner spy exchange during the Carter administration. But he didn't want to emigrate. He wanted to stay in the Soviet Union so he could continue to evangelize. What's very interesting is the Siberian 7 are ready to kind of come to the United States, well, through Israel, and sort of set up here. So they are looking to emigrate, but that was not necessarily the norm or the desire of most evangelicals in the Soviet Union. So there is this kind of range of interest that they have.
Well, and that kind of reflects that that kind of space between spreading the gospel and kind of spreading the American way, right? It feels like sometimes these things are overlapping and sometimes they're not, right? And not everyone involved wants to be, even if they want American power to support their efforts, they don't necessarily want to be American in the way that sort of the classic depiction of anti-communist, anti-Soviet rhetoric would take us.
Well, and that's what I found is that, so often when we talk about these issues, it's sort of strong sense of anti-communism, that must be the sole explanation. And one of the arguments I make in the book is that, of course, anti-communism is important, but the linchpin is the evangelism, the goal to evangelize, because many of the groups that I study would be perfectly happy to just have folks be able to evangelize in the context of the Soviet Union. They're not envisioning it as a way to necessarily bring the Soviet Union's collapse, although we could make the argument that some of this contributed to it. But they want people to be able to evangelize, and they're not as sort of interested necessarily in, they're worried about communism, certainly, but they're worried about communism because communist countries at the time restricted practice of faith. Mm-hmm. So it's which is first, that kind of question, like why the anti-communism? You
mentioned the restricted practice of faith, and of course the Soviet Jewry come to mind there, right? And you've got Soviet Jews showing up at several points in this story, right? In the sense that that they kind of set a model of protesting, and then people like the Siberian 7 passing through Israel, and of course the 21st century alliance between conservative evangelicals and Israel is kind of powerful. So can you sort of connect the dots for us here? Is there a line between those? Are those divergent trends?
No, I mean, I think what we're seeing is it's this development of a particular ethos of human rights that starts, there's a realization in the 1970s that Jewish groups are really working hard to support their co-religionists in the Soviet Union. And evangelicals explicitly take note of this, write about it in their newsletters and magazines. We should be doing the same thing. We have been attentive to persecution of Christians abroad for decades. Why aren't we organizing in Congress in this way? And that encourages them to start to organize on these human rights issues in particular, to develop this human rights language, to talk about their concerns, which is all tied up with their goal for evangelism, for spreading the gospel. What's interesting, of course, is in Israel, they don't evangelize, right? There is generally, that is something they're not supposed to be doing there for a variety of reasons. And there's some very excellent new work on that. I would love to recommend my friend Dan Hummel's book, Covenant Brothers, which is, I think, perhaps the most nuanced read on evangelicalism in Israel that I've ever encountered. He really talks about the ways that evangelicalism developed in Israel and the relationship in a non-polemical way that's very interesting to see. Israel is almost a kind of separate case from all these other foreign policy cases, because what I see is much more consistency with other evangelical interests in the world around these human rights issues, and Israel is kind of separate. And there's been a lot of writing about the kind of prophetic role of it, which Hummel, I think, very accurately argues it captures the imagination, it captures pundits, but it may be an oversimplification of the situation, if that kind of gets at that. So Israel's a kind of special case for evangelicals, but they still use human rights language to talk about Israel. So the human rights language, I think, is very powerful and useful for this group, particularly as we move into the present day and you start to see, again, evangelical advocacy on human trafficking and issues of that sort, but also, again, the International Religious Freedom Act in the late 90s. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about the origins of that act and what it accomplishes?
Yeah, so it's in the 90s, we see a push on the part of evangelical groups as well as Catholic groups, some conservative Catholic groups, and organizations that are concerned about religious freedom. They begin to push, in concert with some key members of Congress, to establish a function within the State Department that will promote religious freedom as a core goal of U.S. foreign policy, right? The idea being that we need to have some sort of piece of the State Department really actively promoting religious freedom, that this is what the US should do. And there's a lot of tangling over it. There's a number of different, I'm not going to go into the different versions of the bills that come out, but it is eventually passed during the Clinton administration. And they do set up they set up a kind of agency within the State Department with the aim of finding different ways to promote religious freedom. And there have been in the years since debates about how effective that is or has been. If it focuses too much on Christian groups as opposed to other groups that face religious persecution. I saw in the chat somebody brought up the Uyghurs in China, and we're not seeing necessarily that kind of full kind of application of what that might look like. And it's also it's a challenge to figure out how exactly you're supposed to make foreign religion or protection of religion a key aspect of foreign relations. What does that look like? It seems to vary over time tremendously. And there are questions about how we define what a persecuted religious group is. I mean, it becomes very sort of dicey and challenging. But the idea was, let's make this a core part of U.S. foreign policy making.
Is the idea of propagation written into that law, or did they use sort of loose language about what religion was to kind of, Yoda might qualify kind of stuff?
It's supposed to be very pluralistic, right? It's not just supposed to be, it is not a law that is going to spread Christianity. But you can see why it would be appealing to evangelicals who say, well, if we're protecting religious freedom, it will allow us to continue to do what we're doing, right? That fits in with that larger trajectory that they're on.
Well, and it also seems like it might, thinking of if you've got these sort of bracketed moments at the beginning and the end of your story, I was really struck by the idea that Barney Frank and Senator Levin were advocating for the Siberian 7, right? So that you have these, liberal Jews working on behalf of a version of human rights that's been defined by conservative Christians. And then on the other hand, the enactment of a law that kind of guts that of its content in a way, right? That it allows it to be so pluralistic that it's maybe not where it's going to go. That reflects a lot of the change in American culture in between.
I think that's right. And then also, I think the point about having liberal senators and representatives on board in the 70s that is really critical because I think it shows the power of this human rights language that evangelicals develop. Now, those senators in the 1980s are much less sympathetic to those kind of arguments when it's being made to support a genocidal dictator in Guatemala or the apartheid regime in South Africa. So they have varying success in terms of how they're able to bring together a large or small coalition. But that language is still really powerful. And it's very useful, I think, again, for the administration. But yes, that law, it's even though they're strong advocates for it, I think they're seeing it as an instrumental rather than the codification of their specific, the specific sort of outcome that they want. The codification of it could potentially facilitate their goals, right? So they're making decisions about how to best accomplish that.
You know, one of the questions that came in on the chat here from Don Llewellyn that I think is really really important is, are there similar efforts by non-Christians in other countries to do these? Are they large? Are they small? Are they successful?
I mean, I do think that the efforts of Jewish interest groups to support their co-religionists are significant and are, you know, that's another diaspora that is, I think, useful to look at as an example, because they are effective at supporting Jews who want to emigrate from the Soviet Union, Jews who are seeking, you know, freedom in the Soviet Union and elsewhere. So I think that's a good example of a non-Christian group. In terms of other international efforts, we certainly see, you know, Catholic groups and well, Catholics are Christians, but there are other groups that are like secular groups that are really effective. You know, these are issues that there are secular organizations that also take them up, right? Like Amnesty International is not concerned about religious freedom. They're looking at it in a different way. Those groups are large and effective. I'm not seeing this. I don't necessarily know if there's the same amount of mobilization in other countries on these issues. That's not something I've specifically looked into or read about. I do see this. The interesting thing about the evangelical case is that evangelicals in other countries also mobilize this cause. So there are evangelicals in England who are really active in these conversations, evangelicals in Germany. So this is not just happening in the United States. I focus on the United States because of the foreign policy implications for the US, but US evangelicals are communicating on these issues with their counterparts in Europe and in other parts of the world as well. So that network is just so large. But of course, again, we're also seeing other Protestant groups that have their own, you know, there is a huge movement against apartheid that is very strongly dominated by liberal Protestant groups and Catholics and others of that sort. We see, again, the Catholics as part of the Solidarity movement. So there are a lot of other really big religiously based, faith-based movements for human rights. They have different end goals than this particular set of evangelicals did.
So I'm wondering about the LDS Church. Obviously, that's one of the largest missionary organizations. Do you see LDS missionaries intersecting with the groups that you're talking about? Do they try to sort of stay apart? What's the story there?
Yeah, what's so interesting, of course, is that the LDS, they send out far more missionaries than anyone else, though those missionary trips vary in length, of course. The difference that I notice is the political organizing. So what I don't see as much in the testimony and the hearings on human rights issues, I didn't find evidence of a lot of LDS members coming to testify. They were focused in a different way in terms of how they were going to go out to the world. They're just not in the 1970s and 1980s as politically organized on these specific issues. That may be changing as we move into the present in terms of seeing more visibility and mobilization. I'm working, I contributed a chapter to a volume about the sort of comparative volume about Protestant versus LDS missions and their influence on world affairs. And it seems like it's moving, they're getting there in their own way, but it's not at the same time that evangelicals were engaging in foreign policy in this way. But it's such a great question because it's a really significant missionary movement.
And I would imagine in many places in the world, the first Christians people encounter would be LDS, but they're not necessarily an indigenous Christian population in the same way, the same partnerships that it seems like you're describing.
Well, and for a long time, not anymore, but for a long time, the full membership in the LDS Church was limited to white white people. So that's going to shape who can be fully brought into the church in a way that was different for these evangelical churches, where even if they were segregated, you know, they were still full members.
Yeah.
Like in South Africa, many of the churches were segregated.
So I know we're just about out of time here, but I have to ask you how your work on foreign policy and your work on museum studies intersect. So do you have an imagined American foreign policy museum?
Oh, I would love that. Yes. And I believe that they're working on a museum of U.S. foreign relations. I would hope that it would include missionaries in the long sweep of U.S. history. Of course, going back to the work that you do and thinking about the way that religion shaped U.S. relations with the rest of the world in the early republic and the revolution, thinking about missionary work in the 19th century, because in so many cases, the line between missionary, diplomat, and trader was very blurred in a way that it's not now. I think there would be a tremendous amount of opportunity to showcase the way that the U.S. operated in the world by looking at these religious groups and their connections, the humanitarian work that some of these groups did. I mean, it's quite extensive. So yeah, I would love to see that. I think it would be fascinating.
Okay, so what are your to put you on the spot, what are your top 3 material culture objects for foreign relations?
For foreign relations.
What would be in this museum as an object? What would you like us to collect?
For religion specifically?
No, for anything.
For anything. Okay, so I have a few. So I love to show this to my students in class. I have this incredible fabric map from 1951 that shows the ocean currents between from Alaska to the Soviet Union, and the flip side shows a kind of larger view. It's a fabric map, so if it gets wet, no problem. But it shows you when you venture into Soviet sea space versus the U.S. It was a map for the Korean War, so that if you were flying over that territory and you got shot down, you would have a map that was quiet, that could get wet, so you could figure out where you were and try to get back to the U.S. side. And really, what's interesting is it's an unused map. So some of these fears about what the Korean War was about, and again, it doesn't show North or South Korea. It shows the U.S. and the Soviet Union. So it really speaks to, I think, the dynamics of that war and what the real concern was on the part of U.S. foreign policymakers. So that's something I always show to my U.S. foreign policy class. I let them touch it and talk to me like what they think they're seeing. So something like that would be really fun. I think when I interned at the Franklin Roosevelt Library when I was in college, and one of the things that I love seeing were all the gifts that people from, that dignitaries would bring to the White House or give to FDR. So I love the idea of the gift exchanges. I think those are really fascinating ways to think about U.S. foreign relations. I think a third one would be the ping. If we could get the ping pong set from when the U.S. team went to China.
That would be fantastic.
Yeah. So there's so many fun ones that would be great. Of course, I'm a 20th century historian. Those are all 20th century examples. I know that there would be interesting ones from earlier as well. My hope is actually, what I'd really love to do is, as a future book, is write a book through material culture, looking at different objects over time as a way to talk about U.S. foreign relations in the early period or the middle period and the modern era.
That, the one that your book really highlighted for me, I kept thinking about these people living for a couple of years in the basement of the Soviet embassy, right? And
yeah,
the the Foreign Affairs Council had Michael McFaul last year talking about his work in that embassy, and the physical space, right? Like sort of the period room of what it was like for them to live there, and maybe they had a cat like Julian Assange. That really strikes my imagination. I want to see that room recreated in your museum.
That'd be amazing. I was talking to Jack Matlock about this, and he remembers sort of commentary about like, well, if we just stop feeding them, maybe it'll go away. But of course, they were providing food and all that in this tiny space for these 7 people. It would be wild to see that. Yeah,
that's amazing.
I still haven't had a chance to visit the museum, but I know they opened, I think about a year ago.
Oh, did they?
To the State Department, the Museum of Diplomatic History. Several of our ambassador friends, like Ambassador Mark Grossman and others, I think have been on the board. And I just looked on the website, and of course it's closed. It's been closed since mid-March, but it sounds to me like you need to be a curator there and an associate in your spare time.
That's the dream, right?
Absolutely. Thank you both so much for really what was a fascinating conversation. Really enjoyed it. And I was getting texts and emails from some of our members saying how much they enjoyed it. And I want to encourage everyone to purchase a copy of To Bring the Good News to All Nations. Purchase it anywhere, but I especially hope that you'll go to interabangbooks.com and get that 10% discount. And as always, go to dfwworld.org to keep up with all of our programs. Thank you so much, ladies, for being with us. And let me remind you as well that North Texas Giving Day is on September 17th, but you can already program, you can actually make your gift. I was looking a few days ago, and there were about 3,000 or 4,000 gifts that had already been made. Actually more than that, but they'd already raised close to $3 million for nonprofits in North Texas. And of course, I hope that you'll open up your heart, open up your wallet, and think about the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth in your giving plans. Have a great day, and I'll see you this Thursday, 11 a.m. Central Daylight Time. Thanks again for watching.